Dear Lord, I am tall. Hello, everyone. Wesley here in the office. Just moved into office, and I'm just here, and I kind of had this idea, and I just had to talk about it to see if anyone at all wanted to listen, because I think it's a cool idea. It's not a practical idea at all. I mean, it'd be useful as all get out, but like, it'd be really hard to get to a point where you could utilize it to 100%. We're talking about computer hardware right now, specifically computer hardware for like workstation computer hardware to be used for things like 3D rendering, video production, different things like that. And even then, it would take the most intense, like Guardians of the Galaxy, anything Disney or larger companies like that would do. And I'm sure like bigger number crunching things could take more use out of it, maybe. I don't really think so because I'm mainly talking more about data transfer speeds. So I was watching a Linus Tech Tip video about taking NVMe M.2 drives and running them in a RAID system to boot off of. So booting off of a RAID on M.2 drives, where each drive is like 3,500 megabit per or megabyte per second transfer read. So you essentially get on your OS drive read write speeds of around 7 gigabytes per second. Now, awesome. Your programs are going to open up really fast, but the problem's going to be you're going to have a bottleneck when you try to go to any other drive. Any USB port, period, on there is going to become a bottleneck because even USB Type C, USB 3.1 Gen 2 ports are only 10 gigabit ports, and when you reach speeds of up to 7 gigabytes per second or something like that, you're 100 gigabit lines now. Your transfer rates are at over 100 or just under 100 gigabit. So this is my ridiculous build for like if I was given like all of the money or all of the sponsorship from anyone ever. This is basically what I would build and try to saturate, but I don't even think I could saturate, and I can saturate some ports on some things. So you take a NVMe RAID boot system, and from there you come out through a 100 gigabit card, whether that be, it's not Ethernet. I think you have to use like I don't remember what the name of it is, but it's a copper connector. So it would end up being like a 6-foot copper cable that came out to a personal server that would literally sit next to the system. So your one system is technically two systems, and the other one being a personal server. So 10 gigabit comes out, which would essentially be a server that is external storage, which would then be set up as another RAID system, which I think would end up being 2 drives for me personally. It would be probably another NVMe system that wouldn't have to be another RAID system, because 3 gigabyte per second transfers is probably fine because this is going to be the export drive. So exporting a project, I don't think you're ever going to need to export anything that's as equal to the RAW, which is usually going to be like Red Raw, Cinema DNG, or something similar to that. And you're probably going to need write speeds of, honestly, like 500 megabytes a second is pretty good, even when you're exporting like a TIFF sequence is a larger one, and I think TIFF is probably going to be the larger of everything else. What is the other one? It's like the update of TIFF, but I even still use TIFF because TIFF supports like matte, transparent, alpha, yada 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 bullcrap kind of stuff. Anyway, so like 500 megabytes per second is still probably going to be a decent write speed. So you could do a regular M.2 drive or NVMe drive, or if you've got like, let's say your server that you're building has like 8 different, not 8, or if it has any more than 2 PCI X16 lanes or something, which I don't think most boards do. I think you're going to have one 16 lane, and then everything else is going to go down to an 8 lane unless you have a really expensive board, which I guess I would have in this. Anyway, what I'm getting at here is you would have one drive that you would export to, and then your other RAID system, it would definitely be a RAID system, would be your pull drive, what your project is stored on. Now, that is a different story, because when you're talking about that, I do multicam events. I don't necessarily do multicam events with Reds, but people do multicam events with Reds, because the newer Reds, with support with their like terabyte drives and terabyte SSDs and stuff like that, and being able to record in ProRes, not a good point, because we need to be sticking about talking like Red Raw. I would just like to put a real quick disclaimer in here that I had said that ProRes wasn't a good example, and I kept bringing up Red and Red Raw files because just by default you would think that because of how crazy Red is with their 8K and different things like that, that the Red Raw files would be the more demanding bitrate files. But that's actually not the case, and I kind of knew this, but I had to go and like double check some specs. All of these specs are based off like the Red Monstro versus the Blackmagic Ursa Mini Pro, because we just shot a movie with the Blackmagic Ursa Mini Pro. And this brings up a whole nother topic of bit rates on ProRes and everything, because like I've known that ProRes was ridiculous and crazy and stuff as far as it comes with bit rates, but we haven't gone into that yet. But on like say a Red 8K with a Monstro server, like under the ideal recording conditions, 8K full format Red code 10:1, you get about 130 megabytes per second in the transfer rate. Now, if you wanted to go like absolutely ridiculous, you could go up to 259 megabytes per second if you go to Red code 5:1. But if we look at shooting in 4K, which is half of the, no, it's not half the resolution. It is a fourth of the resolution from 8K. If we look at shooting in 4K on not even a raw codec, on Apple ProRes XQ, you are at 360 megabytes per second on the transfer rate. So that is 100 megabytes per second more than 5:1 Red code. 6 streams of that could definitely utilize something more than NVMe storage, which is going to go to something around that. And I would just like to add that a live event using 6 Ursa Mini Pros is a lot more reasonable than a live stream running like 6 or even 4 red weapons with monster sensors. And most people aren't going to necessarily think how much crazier ProRes 444 XD or XQ is opposed to even Red Code 5:1 8K. So they're probably just going to crank the ProRes like full blast on something like stuff. Crazy people that are doing live events in Red Raw 8K footage. I hope no one's doing that. This would be the machine you would want to edit it off of, because when you have 4, possibly even 6 streams of Red Raw footage coming in and you're trying to edit that, that's where most of the slowdown is on your system. Your graphics card probably is going to be able to handle it just fine going through a program like Premiere or even Resolve. Resolve, it may even handle it better. Because you can throttle down the resolution and it doesn't have to necessarily calculate so many pixels per second. But regardless of how you're throttling it, that transfer speed from drive to drive is still there. Those lanes still need to be open. So when you talk about doing something like that, then you're gonna want to get into like a standard SSD or even a high performance HDD RAID system. And when you look at like anyone else who watches Linus Tech Tips, when you look at something like Petabyte Project, where he's easily getting 1 GB per second transfers, I think that's mainly because of how many drives he has. So he has probably if he has well over 48 hard drives in his system, then it's easier to get those kind of speeds. But when you're talking about something that's probably going to fit in a case the same size, granted it'll be nothing but hard drives basically, it's going to be more difficult to reach those speeds using hard drives. So I guess you would have to go with something more along the lines of SSD RAID systems. That's going to limit your hard drive capacity then, because in projects that I work with, like a independent feature film is more than likely going to be an average size of about 20 terabytes. That's one project. And that's raw footage. That's not VFX, sound mix, multiple passes of reels and different things like that. That's not counting all of the different advertising exports. And I mean, you're not gonna, even when you have the final project, you don't have one export. If you shot it in 4K, you got to have a 4K export, a 2K export, and then a streaming export that's going to be HD, and then you may have to have even more exports than that. You may have to have an H.264 for web release, a DCP. When you have to make DCPs of the project, then you're getting into, a DCP is going to be the biggest one, because that, depending on the process you go to, you could end up with a 60-minute film could be well over a terabyte in DCP projects. The DCP may end up only being like a 250 gig file, but in order to export the TIFFs out of the entire project and then convert that to JPEG 2000 and yada 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 yada. Anyway, so you need a larger space capacity than you would be able to fill up with SSDs. Even if you got an entire stack of 2 terabyte SSDs, you realistically need at least 80 terabytes of redundant storage. Now, if you have another in-house server that you can pull from, that's different. And I was actually thinking that the personal server can double as a firewall, because if you do networking out, and then this has networking in, and then also networking out that you connect to your routing system and another server if you have one, then the software that you integrate onto the second system here could include actual like hardware firewall. That would be something that's cool, because security is very important for these work systems where you have personal information or secret projects that you're working out that you're trying to release, or different things like that. So I don't really know how you would handle the larger form storage on something like that. If you're set up in a scenario more like Linus is, and I would like to be but am not, where you have a petabyte server with speeds of around a gigabyte to 2 gigabyte transfers per second, then you could get away with something like a 40 terabyte RAID system with SSDs for storage that is not redundant, because you are sending a backup to your server. That being said, why aren't you just pulling off of the server? Well, because the server is going to be built just for storage. And because it's so big, it will have the benefit of being fast, but not as fast as realistically I would want this to be. So, like, I'm not going to get equal speeds that my OS boot drive can take, because I do need a certain point for it to be usable space. I need at least probably 40 terabytes to reasonably do this crazy 8 or really 6 camera red event that I am not doing, that is really unrealistic, but in this unrealistic scenario that I'm presenting, that's what I feel I would need. I would need at least 5 gigabyte transfers on well, no, I probably would need like transfer speeds of an NVMe, so let's say 3 gigabytes per second, but with the space capacity of an HDD RAID system. So yeah, that's just a crazy idea I had. I'm probably not going to post this because I just rambled about absolutely nothing. That was crazy, but